The radio crackled with desperate voices as gunfire erupted across the Afghan mountainside. Inside the command bunker, 12 elite Navy SEALs stared at their monitors in stunned silence. The mission they had trained months for was falling apart in real time. Two high-value terrorist generals were escaping through a heavily fortified compound, and every tactical approach seemed impossible. Then she stepped forward. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been dismissed by most of her male counterparts as just another support soldier. They saw her 5 inches frame and assumed she belonged behind a desk, not in the heat of battle. What they didn't know was that this quiet woman from East LA carried scars that ran deeper than any of theirs, and a determination forged in the fires of personal tragedy that would make her legendary. In the next 60 minutes, while seasoned warriors hesitated and calculated odds, Maria would do something that would be whispered about in military circles for decades to come. She would single-handedly change the course of a mission that could have altered the entire war in Afghanistan. Her actions would save dozens of American lives and eliminate 2 of the most wanted terrorists on the planet. This is the true story of how one woman's courage in the face of impossible odds turned a military disaster into one of the most successful operations in modern warfare history. It's a story of split-second decisions, incredible bravery, and the price of heroism that most people never see. What happened that day in the mountains of Afghanistan would challenge everything the military thought they knew about courage, gender roles, and what it truly means to be a warrior. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos laced up her combat boots for what she thought would be another routine day. At 28 years old, she had been deployed for 8 months, working primarily in intelligence analysis and communications support. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often made her invisible among the towering figures of the elite soldiers who called this remote outpost home. Maria had grown up in the gritty neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, where survival meant learning to be tough while appearing harmless. Her father, Miguel Santos, had been a decorated Marine who served 3 tours in Vietnam before returning home a changed man. The war had left him with demons that he tried to drown in alcohol, and young Maria learned early that sometimes the people you love most can become your greatest threat. When she was 15, those lessons became brutally real. Miguel, in one of his drunken rages, had cornered her mother Elena in their small kitchen. Maria watched in horror as her father, the man she had once idolized, raised his hand to strike the woman who had stood by him through everything. Something snapped inside the teenager that night. Without thinking, Maria grabbed a cast-iron skillet and struck her father hard enough to send him crashing to the floor. The incident changed everything in the Santos household. Miguel, shocked by what he had almost done and what his daughter had been forced to do, finally sought help for his trauma. Elena, seeing the fierce protector her daughter had become, began teaching Maria that strength wasn't about size or aggression, but about knowing when and how to act when others couldn't or wouldn't. These lessons followed Maria into the army, where she excelled not through physical dominance, but through intelligence, precision, and an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure. While other recruits struggled with the mental aspects of combat training, Maria thrived. She could read situations quickly, identify threats that others missed, and make decisions with a clarity that impressed even veteran instructors. But success in training didn't immediately translate to respect in the field. At FOB Chapman, Maria found herself working alongside some of the military's most elite units, including Navy SEAL Team 6, Delta Force operators, and Army Rangers. These were men who had earned their reputations through years of dangerous missions, and many of them struggled to see how a small Latina communications specialist fit into their world of high-stakes warfare. Staff Sergeant Mike Peterson, a massive SEAL team leader with arms like tree trunks, had made his feelings clear from day one. "No offense, Santos," he had said during her first week, "but this ain't the place for someone who belongs behind a desk. When the shooting starts, we need people who can handle the heat." His words stung not because they were cruel, but because Maria feared they might be true. The doubt wasn't just external. Despite her training and her inner fire, Maria sometimes wondered if she had what it took to perform when lives were on the line. Combat training was one thing, but real warfare was entirely different. She had seen seasoned soldiers freeze up during firefights, their training abandoned in the chaos of bullets and explosions. What if she was one of those soldiers who looked tough in practice but crumbled when it mattered most? These insecurities were constantly reinforced by the daily realities of life at the FOB. During mission briefings, Maria often found herself relegated to communications support while the real soldiers planned direct action operations. When supply convoys came under attack, she monitored radio traffic from the safety of the command bunker, while others risked their lives on dangerous rescue missions. Every day that passed without her proving herself in combat felt like confirmation that maybe Peterson and the others were right about her. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that she had joined the military partly to escape the feeling of helplessness she had experienced as a child watching her father's struggles. She wanted to be someone who could make a difference, who could protect others the way she had protected her mother that night in their kitchen. Instead, she found herself in a role where she felt more like an observer than a participant in the mission that mattered most to her. But Maria's perspective began to shift during a convoy ambush 3 months into her deployment. She had been riding in the command vehicle when insurgents attacked their supply run with improvised explosive devices and small arms fire. While the convoy came under intense attack, Maria found herself calmly coordinating communications between the scattered vehicles, calling in medical support, and directing the response that ultimately saved the entire convoy. Captain James Rodriguez, the convoy commander, had been amazed by her performance under fire. "Santos," he told her afterward, "most people panic the first time bullets start flying over their heads. You were cooler than ice out there." It was the first time since arriving in Afghanistan that Maria felt like she belonged, like she might actually have something valuable to contribute to the war effort. The validation gave Maria confidence, but it also highlighted how different her approach to warfare was from the traditional model that dominated military culture. While the SEALs and Rangers relied on overwhelming force and aggressive tactics, Maria's strength lay in her ability to see the bigger picture, to coordinate complex operations, and to find solutions that others missed. She began to realize that maybe the problem wasn't that she didn't fit into their world, but that their world was too narrow to recognize all the different types of strength that modern warfare required. This realization became even clearer during a night raid on a suspected weapons cache 2 weeks later. The assault team had successfully breached the target compound, but found it empty except for an elderly Afghan man who spoke no English. While the frustrated soldiers prepared to leave empty-handed, Maria noticed something the others had missed. The old man kept glancing toward a particular wall, and his nervousness seemed to intensify whenever anyone approached that area. Using the basic Pashto she had been studying, Maria managed to communicate with the man and learned that his grandson had been forced to help hide weapons somewhere in the building. Her patient questioning and cultural sensitivity uncovered a hidden room containing enough explosives to level half the fob. The mission went from failure to major success because Maria had seen what the trained warriors had missed. Word of Maria's contributions began to spread among the special operations community at Chapman, but recognition came slowly and grudgingly. Many of the elite soldiers still saw her successes as lucky breaks rather than evidence of genuine capability. The attitude was perhaps best summed up by Sergeant First Class Danny Walsh, a Delta Force operator who told her, "You've got good instincts, Santos, but instincts only get you so far when you're staring down the barrel of an AK-47. Maria understood their skepticism, even if it frustrated her. These men had earned their reputations through years of direct combat experience, putting their lives on the line in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Her contributions, while valuable, had been largely behind the scenes. Until she proved herself in direct combat, she would always be seen as support personnel rather than a true warrior. The opportunity to change that perception would come sooner than anyone expected, in a mission that would test not just Maria's courage, but the courage of every elite soldier at FOB Chapman. Intelligence had been tracking 2 high-value targets for months. General Ahmad Massoud, a former Afghan military officer who had defected to the Taliban and was now coordinating attacks against American forces, and General Rashid Omar, a veteran Mujahideen commander who had been planning a series of coordinated strikes against NATO bases throughout eastern Afghanistan. The intelligence breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria had been analyzing communications intercepts when she noticed a pattern that others had missed. The terrorists were using a sophisticated code based on references to historical battles, and Maria's knowledge of military history allowed her to crack their system. Her analysis revealed that both generals would be meeting at a compound in the remote Tora Bora region to finalize plans for their upcoming offensive. The mission to capture or kill the 2 generals was assigned to a joint special operations team that included SEALs, Delta Force operators, and Army Rangers. It was exactly the type of high-profile operation that could make careers and save countless American lives. For Maria, it represented the chance she had been waiting for to prove that she belonged among the military's elite. But as the mission planning began, it became clear that her role would once again be limited to communications support. Despite her crucial intelligence work that had made the mission possible, the operational commanders saw her as too valuable and too inexperienced to risk in direct combat. She would monitor the operation from the safety of the command bunker, while others earned the glory and faced the danger she desperately wanted to share. The night before the mission, Maria sat alone in her quarters, cleaning her M4 carbine and thinking about her father's stories from Vietnam. Miguel had often talked about the soldiers who made the difference in critical moments, the ones who stepped up when others couldn't or wouldn't. He had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. As she prepared her equipment, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to sit in a bunker while others fought the battle she had helped make possible. If the opportunity arose, she was going to prove once and for all that she belonged on the front lines with the warriors she had come to respect and admire. She just had to hope that when that moment came, her courage would be equal to the challenge. The helicopter blades cut through the thin mountain air as the assault team approached their target in the pre-dawn darkness. Maria sat in the command bunker at FOB Chapman, surrounded by glowing monitors and radio equipment, watching the operation unfold through drone feeds, and listening to the calm, professional voices of the soldiers she wished she could be fighting alongside. The compound was nestled in a narrow valley between two ridgelines, surrounded by high stone walls and accessed by only one road. Intelligence suggested that Generals Massoud and Omar had arrived the previous evening with a small security detail for their crucial planning meeting. The assault team, led by Lieutenant Commander Jack Harrison from SEAL Team 6, consisted of 12 elite operators who had trained together for months specifically for this type of precision operation. Everything about the mission had been planned to perfection. The team would fast-rope from helicopters onto the compound walls at exactly 0300 hours, when the guards would be least alert. Overwatch snipers would eliminate any sentries simultaneously, while the main assault force breached the central building where the generals were believed to be sleeping. The entire operation was expected to take less than 20 minutes from insertion to extraction. Maria watched the first phase unfold flawlessly on her screens. The helicopters approached silently, their pilots using night vision to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain. The assault team fast-roped onto the compound walls with practiced precision. Their movements coordinated like a deadly ballet. Sniper rifles whispered in the darkness as enemy sentries dropped without raising an alarm. Within 3 minutes, the team had secured the outer perimeter and was moving toward the main building. But as the SEALs approached the central structure, something felt wrong. The compound was too quiet, too easy. There should have been more guards, more resistance. Harrison's voice crackled over the radio with the first hint of concern. "Command, this feels off. No interior guards, no movement in the target building. Possible dry hole." Maria frowned as she studied the thermal imaging from the overhead drone. The building that was supposed to contain their high-value targets showed no heat signatures, no signs of recent occupancy, but something in the intelligence intercepts she had analyzed bothered her. The terrorists had been too careful about operational security to suddenly become careless about their location. This felt like a setup, but she wasn't sure what kind. Her fears were confirmed moments later when the compound exploded into chaos. Hidden machine gun nests opened fire from concealed positions in the surrounding ridgelines, and the abandoned building suddenly came alive with muzzle flashes. The assault team, caught in the open courtyard, found themselves in a deadly crossfire with nowhere to run. "Contact! Contact! We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions." Harrison's voice had lost its calm professionalism as bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off the stone walls around his team. "This was a trap. The whole damn place is crawling with hostiles." Maria's blood ran cold as she watched the ambush unfold on her screens. The elite soldiers who had looked invincible during training were now scrambling for cover, pinned down by intense enemy fire from positions they hadn't known existed. The thermal imaging revealed at least 40 enemy fighters surrounding the compound, with more arriving by the minute. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Corpsman Second Class Rodriguez went down with a bullet in his leg. Then Sergeant Williams took shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade that demolished the wall he had been using for cover. The assault team was trapped in an open kill zone with limited ammunition and no way to reach their extraction point. In the command bunker, the atmosphere was tense with barely controlled panic. Colonel Matthews, the operation commander, was shouting orders into his radio while intelligence officers scrambled to understand how their perfect mission had turned into a disaster. Maria found herself analyzing the enemy positions on her screen, trying to find some weakness that could help extract the trapped soldiers. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. The thermal imaging showed 2 heat signatures moving between buildings on the far side of the compound, away from the main battle. The signatures were moving with purpose and confidence, and they were headed toward what appeared to be a vehicle staging area behind the compound. "Colonel," Maria called out, her voice cutting through the chaos in the bunker. "I've got 2 individuals moving toward possible extraction vehicles on the south side of the compound. Based on their movement patterns and the protection they're receiving, these could be our high-value targets trying to escape." Colonel Matthews barely glanced at her screen. "Santos, we've got 12 men trapped in there. The targets are secondary right now." But Maria knew he was wrong. If Masood and Omar escaped, the intelligence they carried about future attacks would die with them. More importantly, the assault team's sacrifice would be for nothing. These generals had been planning coordinated strikes that could kill hundreds of American soldiers. Letting them escape wasn't just a mission failure, it was a death sentence for countless others. The tactical situation continued to worsen. The enemy had positioned their fighters with devastating effectiveness, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any movement across the compound courtyard virtually suicidal. The assault team's advanced training and equipment were being neutralized by superior positioning and numerical advantage. Staff Sergeant Peterson, the massive SEAL who had questioned Maria's place on the base, was now coordinating defensive positions while Harrison tried to call in air support. But the mountains made radio communications difficult, and the closest Apache gunships were still 20 minutes away. 20 minutes that the trapped soldiers didn't have. "We need to do something now." Peterson's voice crackled over the radio, strain evident despite his training. "Rodriguez is losing blood fast, and we're down to our last magazines. If we don't move soon, we're not moving at all." Maria stared at her screens, her mind racing through possible solutions. The compound layout was burned into her memory from hours of mission planning. She knew every building, every wall, every possible approach route, and she could see something that the men in the command bunker, focused on the immediate crisis, were missing. There was a route to the south side of the compound that avoided the main killing field. It would require someone to move alone, using a drainage ditch that ran along the outer wall, then climb over a section of wall that was hidden from the main enemy positions. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it offered the only chance to either eliminate the escaping generals or create enough of a distraction to help the assault team escape. The more Maria studied the route, the more convinced she became that it could work. But it would require someone who was small enough to move through the drainage ditch, skilled enough to navigate the terrain in darkness, and brave enough to take on unknown enemies alone. Everyone in the command bunker was focused on trying to save the trapped assault team, which meant no one was thinking about stopping the escaping targets. Except Maria. She looked around the bunker at the officers and analysts scrambling to manage the crisis. These were good people, dedicated professionals who were doing everything they could to save American lives. But they were thinking like staff officers, not like warriors. They were managing the crisis instead of solving it. Maria thought about her father's stories from Vietnam, about the moments when individual soldiers had to make decisions that their superiors couldn't or wouldn't make. She thought about the cast iron skillet in her mother's kitchen, about the moment when she had to choose between safety and doing what was right. Most of all, she thought about the 12 men trapped in that compound who had finally accepted her as part of their team. The decision formed in her mind with crystalline clarity. Someone had to go after those generals, and everyone else was either trapped in the compound or focused on command responsibilities in the bunker. That left only her. Maria began moving toward the bunker exit, her hand resting on her sidearm. She moved quietly, hoping to slip out without being noticed until it was too late to stop her. But Colonel Matthews spotted her before she reached the door. "Santos, where do you think you're going? I need you monitoring communications." Maria turned to face him, and Matthews was surprised by the steel in her eyes. "Sir, with respect, someone needs to stop those generals from escaping. The assault team is pinned down, and by the time air support arrives, our targets will be gone." "Absolutely not," Matthews said firmly. "You're not trained for direct action operations, and I'm not sending another soldier into that meat grinder." But as Maria looked around the bunker, she realized that Matthews was wrong about one crucial thing. She was trained for this, maybe not in the conventional sense that the SEALs and Rangers were trained, but in ways that mattered just as much. She had grown up in a war zone, learned to survive by being smart instead of strong, learned to strike at the right moment instead of the obvious moment. "Colonel," she said quietly, "those men in there accepted me as part of their team. I'm not going to let them down by sitting in a bunker while their sacrifice means nothing." Before Matthews could respond, Maria was moving again, this time with purpose and determination that brooked no argument. Behind her she could hear the colonel shouting orders, but she was already out the door and moving toward the motor pool where she could acquire the equipment she needed. The night air was cold against her face as she ran toward an uncertain fate, But for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, Maria Santos felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The little girl who had protected her mother with a cast-iron skillet was about to become the woman who would change the course of a war. Maria's heart pounded as she reached the motor pool, her breath visible in the frigid mountain air. Behind her, she could hear Colonel Matthews barking orders into his radio, trying to coordinate her immediate recall. But Maria knew that by the time anyone could physically stop her, she would already be committed to a course of action that couldn't be undone. She quickly inventoried the equipment available to her: a lightweight tactical vest, night vision goggles, her M4 carbine with 6 magazines of ammunition, 2 fragmentation grenades, and her Beretta M9 sidearm. It wasn't much compared to the heavy weapons and specialized gear that the assault team carried, but Maria had learned long ago that success often depended more on strategy than firepower. The compound was 8 miles away through treacherous mountain terrain. Maria could have taken one of the all-terrain vehicles, but the engine noise would announce her presence long before she reached her destination. Instead, she chose a military motorcycle, a quiet dirt bike that could navigate the narrow mountain trails without alerting every enemy fighter in the valley. As she started the engine, her radio crackled with Colonel Matthews' voice. "Santos, return to base immediately. That's a direct order." Maria keyed her radio one last time. "Sir, 12 men are going to die if someone doesn't do something different. I'm sorry, but I can't follow that order." She switched off her radio before Matthews could respond, knowing that staying in communication would only provide him with a way to track her location and potentially compromise her mission. From this point forward, she was truly alone. The motorcycle bumped and weaved along the mountain paths as Maria pushed toward the compound. She had studied these trails extensively during mission planning, but navigating them in darkness while wearing night vision goggles was more challenging than she had anticipated. Several times she nearly lost control on loose gravel or unexpected drops, but her years of riding dirt bikes in the hills around Los Angeles served her well. As she got closer to the target area, Maria could hear the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. The battle was still raging, which meant the assault team was still alive and fighting. But she could also see the glow of fires in the distance, suggesting that the situation was continuing to deteriorate. 2 miles from the compound, Maria abandoned the motorcycle and continued on foot. The drainage ditch she had identified on the thermal imaging was exactly where the intelligence maps had indicated, running along the base of the mountain toward the outer wall of the compound. The ditch was barely 3 feet deep and filled with rocks and debris, but it provided the concealment she needed to approach undetected. Crawling through the ditch was slow, painful work. The rocks cut through her clothing and scraped against her skin, while the weight of her equipment made every movement more difficult. But Maria had crawled through worse places as a child in East LA, hiding from her father's drunken rages or avoiding gang members who controlled her neighborhood streets. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. The sound of gunfire grew louder as she approached the compound, and she could now distinguish between different types of weapons. The sharp crack of American M4 rifles was being answered by the deeper bark of AK-47s, while the occasional explosion indicated that both sides were using grenades. The battle was clearly intense, but the fact that it was still ongoing suggested that neither side had gained a decisive advantage. Maria reached the outer wall of the compound after an hour of careful movement. The stone barrier was about 12 feet high, topped with razor wire that gleamed in the moonlight. But just as the intelligence photos had shown, there was a section where recent rockfall had created a natural ramp that would allow someone to climb over without cutting themselves on the wire. Before attempting the climb, Maria took a moment to study the compound layout one more time. The main battle was taking place in the central courtyard, where the assault team had been trapped by enemy crossfire. But the southern section of the compound, where she had observed the 2 heat signatures moving, was relatively quiet. If the generals were indeed trying to escape, they would be focused on getting away rather than fighting, which meant they might be vulnerable to a surprise attack. The climb over the wall was terrifying. Maria felt completely exposed as she hauled herself over the stone barrier, certain that enemy sentries would spot her at any moment. But the noise of the main battle provided excellent cover for her movements, and the enemy fighters seemed to be focused entirely on the trapped assault team. Once inside the compound, Maria found herself in a maze of stone buildings and narrow alleys that looked very different from the overhead photos she had studied. The intelligence maps had shown the basic layout, but they hadn't captured the complexity of the architecture or the numerous hiding places that could conceal enemy fighters. Every shadow could hide a threat, every doorway could contain an ambush. Moving carefully from building to building, Maria made her way toward the southern section of the compound, where she had observed the suspicious movement. Her night vision goggles turned the world into an eerie green landscape, but they also allowed her to spot details that would have been invisible to the naked eye. She found the first piece of evidence that she was on the right track when she discovered fresh tire tracks in the dirt near what appeared to be a motor pool. 2 vehicles had recently been moved from covered positions, and the tracks led toward a gate in the southern wall of the compound. Someone was definitely planning an escape route, and they had already moved their transportation into position. The sound of voices speaking in Pashto drew her attention to a nearby building. Maria crept closer, using her limited knowledge of the language to try to understand what was being discussed. She caught enough words to realize that the speakers were talking about evacuation procedures and timing. These weren't common fighters. They were people important enough to have escape plans. Positioning herself at a window that had been damaged by gunfire, Maria peered into the building and felt her heart stop. 2 men in traditional Afghan robes were bent over a map spread across a wooden table, pointing at various locations, while a third man stood guard near the door. Even in the green glow of her night vision goggles, she recognized the faces from the intelligence briefings she had studied for months. General Ahmed Massoud was exactly as described, tall, thin, with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jawline. General Rashid Omar was shorter and stockier, with a grey beard that reached nearly to his chest. Both men carried themselves with the confidence of experienced military commanders, and both were clearly preparing to leave the compound while their subordinates continued fighting the trapped American forces. Maria's mind raced through her options. She could try to call in an airstrike, but her radio was turned off, and she wasn't sure she could get a signal through the mountains anyway. She could attempt to capture the generals alive, but that would require subduing 3 armed men in close quarters, which seemed unlikely to succeed. Or she could engage them directly, accepting that this would probably be a one-way mission, but ensuring that these 2 terrorist leaders could never again plan attacks against American forces. The decision was made easier by what she overheard next. General Omar was speaking in accented English, apparently for the benefit of someone who didn't speak Pashto fluently. "The Americans will never expect our next operation," he was saying. 3 simultaneous attacks on their largest bases will kill hundreds of their soldiers and break their will to continue fighting. Maria felt a cold rage settle over her as she realized what she was hearing. These men weren't just escaping. They were finalizing plans for attacks that would kill hundreds of her fellow soldiers. Everything she had been through, every moment of doubt and discrimination she had endured, suddenly crystallized into absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. She checked her weapon one more time, ensuring that a round was chambered and her safety was off. The M4 carbine felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, an extension of her will rather than just a tool. All those hours on the firing range, all that training that some had dismissed as inadequate preparation for real combat, suddenly felt like destiny bringing her to this exact moment. General Massoud was pointing at locations on the map where they planned to position truck bombs, describing how the coordinated explosions would maximize casualties among sleeping soldiers. General Omar was nodding and adding details about weapons shipments that were already in position near American bases. The guard was checking his watch, apparently anxious to begin their evacuation. Maria took a deep breath and thought about the 12 men trapped in the compound courtyard, fighting for their lives while these 2 generals planned the deaths of hundreds more Americans. She thought about her father, finally finding peace after his demons from Vietnam, and she thought about her mother, who had taught her that protecting others was worth any personal cost. The little girl with the cast-iron skillet was about to become the woman who would change history. Maria stepped through the damaged window into the room, her weapon raised and her finger on the trigger. The 3 men looked up in shock, clearly not expecting to see an American soldier in what they had thought was a secure area. For a split second, nobody moved, as if the universe was holding its breath before unleashing violence that would echo through the mountains of Afghanistan for years to come. "Nobody move," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "General Massoud, General Omar, you're both under arrest."
The guard recovered from his surprise first, reaching for his AK-47 with desperate speed.
But Maria had been preparing for this moment since she entered the compound, and her response was immediate and decisive. 2 quick bursts from her M4 dropped the guard before his weapon cleared its sling. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, and Maria's ears were ringing as she swung her weapon toward the 2 generals. Both men were reaching for sidearms, their faces twisted with rage and determination. But they were commanders, not frontline fighters, and their movements were slow compared to the reflexes Maria had developed through months of intensive training in a lifetime of dangerous situations. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years to come, analyzed by tacticians and used as a case study in special operations schools around the world. In less than 10 seconds, one small woman had accomplished what an entire assault team had been unable to achieve, changing the course of a battle and possibly an entire war. But for Maria, standing in that room with smoke still rising from her weapon, the moment felt strangely peaceful. She had finally found her place in the war, and she had finally proven to herself and everyone else that courage came in many different forms. The scared little girl from East LA had become the woman who would never let evil escape, while she had the power to stop it. Time seemed to move in slow motion as Maria faced the two most wanted terrorists in Afghanistan. General Massoud's hand was halfway to his holstered pistol when their eyes met across the smoke-filled room. In that instant, she saw not just an enemy combatant, but a man who had orchestrated the deaths of dozens of American soldiers and was planning to kill hundreds more. The general's face showed no fear, only calculation and cold determination. He was a veteran of decades of warfare, from the Soviet invasion through the Civil War and now the American occupation. He had survived by being faster and more ruthless than his enemies, and Maria could see in his expression that he intended to survive this encounter as well. General Omar was moving more slowly, his older body not as quick to respond to the threat. But Maria could see the intelligence in his eyes, the mind that had planned countless ambushes and attacks against coalition forces. Even as he reached for his weapon, she could tell he was analyzing the situation, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. The mathematical precision of combat that Maria had learned in training took over her conscious mind. Distance to target 12 feet. Multiple hostiles. 2 armed, potentially others nearby. Ammunition remaining, full magazine, 28 rounds. Escape routes, window behind her, door to her left, unknown passages deeper in the building. But beneath the tactical calculations, Maria's mind was processing something deeper. These weren't just enemy soldiers following orders. They were the architects of terrorism, the planners whose strategies had killed and maimed countless innocent people. The intelligence files she had studied contained photographs of their handiwork. Bombed schools, destroyed hospitals, families torn apart by their coordinated campaigns of violence. General Massoud's pistol cleared its holster just as Maria made her decision. Her first burst caught him center mass, the .223 rounds from her M4 striking with devastating effect at close range. The general's weapon discharged into the ceiling as he fell, his carefully laid plans for future attacks dying with him. General Omar had managed to draw his sidearm and was bringing it to bear on Maria when her second burst found its mark. The old Mujahideen commander, who had fought the Soviets in these same mountains decades earlier, collapsed beside the map that showed his planned attacks on American bases. The silence that followed the gunfire was broken only by Maria's heavy breathing and the distant sounds of battle from other parts of the compound. She stood motionless for several seconds, her weapon still trained on the two bodies, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Maria Santos, the communications specialist who many had thought belonged behind a desk, had just killed 2 of the most wanted terrorists in the world. But there was no time for reflection. The sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside indicated that other enemy fighters were responding to the gunfire. Maria quickly searched the bodies, taking documents and electronic devices that might contain valuable intelligence. The map on the table showed detailed plans for the coordinated attacks Omar had been describing, with target locations, timing, and personnel assignments that would be crucial for preventing future casualties. As she stuffed the intelligence materials into her pack, Maria could hear voices in the corridor getting closer. The enemy fighters were conducting a systematic search of the building, calling out to their dead comrades and becoming increasingly agitated when they received no response. The room had only 2 exits, the door she had entered through and a window on the opposite wall. The door led back into the building where the enemy fighters were searching, while the window opened onto a narrow alley that might provide an escape route. But Maria realized that simply escaping wasn't enough. The trapped assault team was still pinned down in the central courtyard, and unless something changed dramatically, they were all going to die. Looking at the intelligence materials she had captured, Maria saw an opportunity that went beyond just her own survival. The documents showed the exact positions of the enemy forces around the compound, including machine gun nests and sniper positions that the assault team couldn't see from their trapped position. With this information, she could guide the Americans out of the kill zone and turn the tables on their attackers. But first, she had to get out of the building alive. The window led to an alley between 2 stone buildings, barely wide enough for a person to move through sideways. Maria could hear enemy fighters on both ends of the alley, coordinating their search efforts and setting up positions to trap anyone who might be hiding in the narrow space. She activated her radio hoping to reach the assault team despite the mountain interference that had been plaguing communications all night. Static filled her earpiece for several seconds before Lieutenant Commander Harrison's voice broke through. "Command, we're running low on ammunition, and Rodriguez needs immediate medical attention."
We need extract or resupply within 10 minutes or we're not making it out of here.
Maria keyed her radio, knowing that her transmission might give away her position, but also knowing that the information she had was too important to keep to herself.
"Harrison, this is Santos. Do you copy?" The surprise in Harrison's voice was evident even through the static and interference. "Santos, what the hell are you doing out here? Command said you went AWOL. I'm in the compound, south side. I've eliminated both high-value targets and captured intelligence showing enemy positions around your location. I can guide you out of there." There was a long pause before Harrison responded, and Maria could imagine him trying to process the idea that the communication specialist he had barely acknowledged was somehow inside the enemy compound and claiming to have accomplished their primary mission objective. "Santos, I need you to confirm that last transmission. Did you say you eliminated both targets?" "Confirmed. Masood and Omar are both down. I have captured documents showing planned attacks on our bases, and I can see enemy positions that are keeping you pinned down." The sound of boots on stone was getting closer as enemy fighters continued their search. Maria knew she had to move soon or risk being trapped in the building, but she also knew that the information she possessed could be the key to saving the assault team. "Harrison, you need to listen carefully because I may not be able to maintain communications much longer. The machine gun nest that's been keeping you pinned down is in a building 40 meters northeast of your position. There's a sniper in the tower that overlooks the courtyard, and they have RPG teams positioned on the walls at your 6 and 9 o'clock positions." As Maria transmitted the enemy positions, she was moving toward the window, preparing to escape into the alley. But the sound of automatic weapons fire from the corridor indicated that the enemy fighters had discovered the bodies of their leaders and were now searching for their killer with desperate intensity. "Santos, how do you know all this?" Harrison asked. "I found their tactical plans. Harrison, they were planning coordinated attacks on our major bases that would have killed hundreds of our people. This intelligence has to get back to command." The first enemy fighter appeared at the door of the room just as Maria dove through the window into the alley. Bullets splintered the window frame where she had been standing moments before, and she could hear angry voices shouting in Pashto as the search intensified. The alley was a death trap, barely wide enough for her to move, and with enemy fighters at both ends. But Maria had grown up navigating the narrow spaces between buildings in East LA, and she had learned that sometimes the most dangerous path was actually the safest, because enemies didn't expect anyone to be desperate enough to take it. Moving quickly but quietly, Maria worked her way along the alley toward what appeared to be a drainage opening that led under one of the buildings. The space was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it might provide a way to reach the compound's outer wall without being detected. Her radio crackled with Harrison's voice. "Santos, we're going to try to take out that machine gun nest based on your intelligence. If you're wrong about this, we're all dead." "I'm not wrong," Maria replied, squeezing herself into the drainage tunnel. "Trust me." As she crawled through the narrow space, Maria could hear the sound of grenades exploding in the distance. The assault team was fighting back, using her intelligence to target enemy positions they couldn't have known about otherwise. If her information was accurate, they might actually have a chance to break out of the trap that had seemed certain to kill them all. But Maria's immediate concern was her own survival. The drainage tunnel led to a larger culvert that ran beneath the compound, part of an old irrigation system that predated the current buildings. Following the tunnel toward what she hoped was the outer wall, Maria found herself in complete darkness, relying on her night vision goggles to navigate the treacherous underground passage. The sound of gunfire above her was becoming more sporadic, which could mean either that the assault team was running out of ammunition, or that they were successfully eliminating enemy positions. Maria hoped it was the latter, but she knew that her own mission was far from over. She still had to escape the compound, get the captured intelligence back to command, and somehow survive long enough to see whether her actions had made any difference in the larger war against terrorism. The scared little girl from East LA had just proven that she belonged among the world's elite warriors, but now she had to prove that she was smart enough and tough enough to live to tell about it. Behind her, the sounds of battle continued to echo through the mountains of Afghanistan, but for the first time since the operation had begun, those sounds carried the rhythm of American forces taking control rather than fighting for survival. Maria Santos had changed the course of the battle, but the night was far from over. The drainage tunnels seemed to stretch forever in the darkness as Maria crawled through decades of accumulated debris and stagnant water. Her night vision goggles provided just enough illumination to navigate the treacherous passage, but every few meters she encountered obstacles that forced her to squeeze through impossibly tight spaces or navigate around collapsed sections of the old irrigation system. Above her, the sound of gunfire was changing. The constant chatter of enemy AK-47s was becoming more sporadic, while the sharp crack of American M4 rifles was growing more frequent and organized. Maria allowed herself a moment of hope that her intelligence was helping the assault team turn the tide of the battle. Her radio crackled with Lieutenant Commander Harrison's voice, clearer now than it had been earlier. "Santos, I don't know how you got that intel, but it was spot on. We took out the machine gun nest and 2 RPG positions. We're moving to secure the compound." Maria keyed her radio while still crawling through the tunnel. "Harrison, be advised there may be additional enemy forces in the underground tunnels. This whole place is connected by old irrigation passages." "Copy that. Santos, what's your status? Can you make it to the extraction point?" The question hung in the air as Maria considered her situation. She was alone in enemy territory, crawling through tunnels that might be filled with hostile fighters, carrying intelligence that could prevent future terrorist attacks, but only if she could get it back to base alive. The extraction point was still over a mile away through terrain that was probably swarming with enemy reinforcements responding to the battle. "I'm working on it," she replied, not wanting to worry the assault team with her uncertain prospects. The tunnel finally opened into what appeared to be an underground chamber, part of an ancient fortress that had been built into the mountainside long before the current compound existed. Maria found herself in a space large enough to stand upright, with stone walls that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of her night vision. But she wasn't alone in the chamber. 3 enemy fighters were crouched around a battery-powered radio, apparently coordinating reinforcements for the battle above. They looked up in shock as Maria emerged from the drainage tunnel, her mud-covered uniform and night vision goggles making her appear like some kind of apparition from their worst nightmares. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Maria had the advantage of surprise and superior equipment, but the enemy fighters had the advantage of numbers and familiarity with the terrain. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls in the confined space as Maria dove for cover behind ancient stone columns. One of the fighters went down immediately, caught by Maria's first burst as he reached for his weapon. The second managed to get off several rounds before Maria's return fire silenced his AK-47 permanently. The third fighter, younger and more agile than his companions, managed to escape into another tunnel before Maria could engage him effectively. The brief firefight had used up more of Maria's ammunition and revealed her position to any other enemy forces that might be in the underground passages. But it had also provided her with the dead fighter's radio, which was receiving reports about the battle above in Pashto that she could partially understand. From what she could make out, the assault team's counterattack had been more successful than anyone had dared hope. Several enemy positions had been overrun, and the fighters who had seemed so confident earlier were now calling desperately for reinforcements and evacuation support. The tide of the battle had turned decisively in favor of the Americans. But Maria's celebration was cut short by the sound of voices in the tunnels around her. The fighter who had escaped was apparently leading other enemy forces toward her position, and she could hear them coordinating search efforts in multiple directions. The underground passages that had provided her with concealment were now becoming a trap. She found another tunnel leading in what she hoped was the direction of the compound's outer wall. This passage was even more treacherous than the first, with frequent cave-ins and pools of stagnant water that forced her to crawl on her belly through spaces barely larger than her body. As she moved through the darkness, Maria reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the past few hours. She had gone from being a dismissed support soldier to someone who had personally eliminated 2 high-value terrorist targets and provided intelligence that had saved an entire assault team. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that she possessed the courage and capability to act when others couldn't or wouldn't. The tunnel finally emerged into a natural cave opening on the mountainside, well beyond the compound's outer wall. Maria found herself looking down into the valley where the battle had taken place, and she could see the compound clearly illuminated by fires and the lights of arriving helicopters. The cavalry had arrived. Apache attack helicopters were circling the compound, their chain guns eliminating the last pockets of resistance. Medical evacuation helicopters were landing in the courtyard to evacuate wounded soldiers, while additional assault teams were fast roping in to secure the area and search for intelligence materials. Maria's radio came alive with multiple voices as the operation shifted from combat to cleanup mode. "All stations, this is Overlord. Compound is secure. Begin evidence recovery operations and casualty evacuation. Lieutenant Commander Harrison's voice cut through the chatter. Command, we have 12 men accounted for, 3 wounded but stable. Primary mission objectives have been accomplished. Both high-value targets are confirmed dead. There was a pause before Colonel Matthews responded from the command bunker. Harrison, confirm that last transmission. Both targets are confirmed eliminated? Affirmative. Staff Sergeant Santos eliminated both targets and provided intelligence that allowed us to break contact and secure the compound. The silence that followed lasted several seconds, and Maria could imagine the shock in the command bunker as officers tried to process what they were hearing. The communications specialist who had disobeyed direct orders and gone AWOL had somehow accomplished the mission's primary objectives single-handedly. Maria activated her radio for what she knew might be the last time before facing the consequences of her unauthorized actions. Command, this is Santos. I'm approximately 1 click south of the compound with captured intelligence materials. Requesting pickup. Colonel Matthews' voice was carefully controlled when he responded. Santos, maintain your position. Recovery team is en route to your location. As Maria waited for pickup, she inventoried the intelligence materials she had captured. The documents included detailed plans for the coordinated attacks on American bases, lists of weapons caches and safe houses, and communications protocols that would be invaluable for future operations against terrorist networks. The electronic devices contained contact information for terrorist cells across Afghanistan and Pakistan. But perhaps most importantly, the materials revealed the scope of the network that Generals Massoud and Omar had been coordinating. Their deaths would disrupt planned attacks and save countless lives, but the intelligence would allow coalition forces to roll up entire terrorist networks and prevent future operations from being organized. 20 minutes later, Maria heard the distinctive sound of a Black Hawk helicopter approaching her position. She activated an infrared strobe to mark her location and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her back at base. The helicopter touched down briefly, and Maria ran through the rotor wash to climb aboard. She was surprised to see Colonel Matthews himself in the crew compartment, along with several intelligence officers who immediately began examining the materials she had captured. Matthews studied Maria for a long moment before speaking, his expression unreadable. Santos, do you have any idea what you've done? Maria met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. I've eliminated 2 high-value targets and captured intelligence that will save American lives. You've also disobeyed direct orders, left your assigned position without authorization, and conducted an unauthorized combat operation that could have resulted in a diplomatic incident if it had gone wrong. Yes, sir. I understand that. Matthews was quiet for several more minutes as he read through some of the captured documents. Finally, he looked up at Maria again. These plans they were making, if these attacks had succeeded, we could have lost hundreds of soldiers. Yes, sir. That's why I couldn't stay in the bunker. The flight back to FOB Chapman passed in relative silence as the intelligence officers continued analyzing Maria's captured materials and the medical team attended to Rodriguez and the other wounded soldiers from the assault team. Maria found herself wondering whether she would be court-martialed for disobeying orders or decorated for heroism. Perhaps both. As the helicopter approached the base, Maria could see crowds of soldiers gathering on the landing pad. Word of the mission's success had apparently spread quickly, and everyone wanted to see the assault team that had accomplished what many had thought impossible. But as Maria stepped off the helicopter, she noticed something unexpected. Staff Sergeant Peterson, the massive SEAL who had questioned her place on the base, was waiting for her at the edge of the landing zone. His expression was serious but no longer dismissive. Santos, he said as she approached, I owe you an apology. What you did tonight, that took guts I didn't think you had. Maria nodded, accepting the acknowledgement she had worked so hard to earn. We're all on the same team, Peterson. I just wanted to make sure we all made it home. Over the following weeks, as the intelligence Maria had captured led to dozens of successful operations against terrorist networks throughout the region, the story of her unauthorized mission became legendary among special operations forces. Some criticized her for disobeying orders, but most recognized that sometimes military doctrine had to yield to individual initiative and moral courage. Maria was eventually awarded the Silver Star for her actions, making her one of the few women to receive the decoration for direct action against enemy forces. But more importantly to her, she had finally found her place in the military community that had initially rejected her. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, whose life she had helped save, perhaps summed it up best during the awards ceremony. War is not just about following orders or using the biggest weapons. Sometimes it's about one person having the courage to do what needs to be done when everyone else hesitates. Maria Santos reminds us that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and courage is not determined by gender or job description. Years later, when Maria had returned to civilian life and was working as a federal law enforcement officer, she would sometimes think back to that night in the mountains of Afghanistan. The scared little girl from East LA had become the woman who changed the course of a war, not through overwhelming force or political maneuvering, but through the simple willingness to act when action was required. The cast iron skillet in her mother's kitchen had been the first weapon Maria had ever wielded in defense of others. But on a cold night in Afghanistan, she had proven that the spirit behind that childhood moment could grow into something powerful enough to alter history itself. The lesson she took from that experience was simple but profound. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by the people who are supposed to fight them, but by the people who choose to fight them when no one else will. In a world full of complex problems and institutional failures, individual courage and moral clarity still mattered more than rank, training, or official authorization. Maria Santos had hesitated when the SEAL team couldn't act, but when she finally moved, she moved with the decisive force that comes from absolute moral certainty. The two generals who died that night had planned to kill hundreds of American soldiers, and those soldiers went home to their families because one woman decided that following orders was less important than saving lives. That decision, made in a moment of crisis by someone who had been dismissed and underestimated by almost everyone around her, became the kind of story that military academies would study for generations to come. Not because it provided a perfect model to follow, but because it demonstrated that sometimes the right action requires breaking the rules. And sometimes, the most important victories are won by people who were never supposed to be in the fight at all.